this morning needs no introduction. Are you sure?
Thank you, Pat. Appreciate that. Well, this is an unusual sermon for an OCS reunion. We always meet in October, and so we don't get much of an opportunity to talk about Christmas. So I thought I would share some research that I'd done last year about the truth about Christmas. Turns out there are a lot of myths I discovered about Christmas. So I thought it might be interesting for you if we were to share some of those myths and what the truth about Christmas really is. Not that you can go back home and throw away all your Christmas decorations, and particularly not that you can tell the grandkids Santa Claus isn't real. I know it's a surprise to some of you, but Santa Claus isn't real, at least in physical form. So anyway, I thought it might be good to share some of that research with you, at least so you'll be informed about the truth. And there are so many myths about spiritual things anyway. Whatever denomination or religion you are, whatever religious process you go through when you're back home in your church, there are many unnecessary things that we spiritual people tend to include in our worship and in our religious processes. We have certain things that we think are absolutely required for it to be holy or spiritual. I do remember one preacher in Tennessee who almost got fired from his church. This is a little country church. He almost got fired from his church because he didn't have time to do a Sunday morning bulletin. And so the people did get handed a bulletin about the sequence of the service. And the deacons came really close to firing this guy. Which, I mean, you look all through the Bible and you can't find a bulletin in the Bible. Or a sequence of music or whatever the case may be. Particularly, Pat, there's no announcements in the Bible. So churches tend to hold a lot of store in making announcements. So I thought I would share some of the myths of Christmas with you. And when I say Christmas, you all have this idea come into your mind about what happens at Christmas. And there's a Christmas tree, and there's a nativity scene, and there's all kinds of stuff, and the wise men are kneeling and laying gifts, and there's a big star over the top shining, and so on and so forth. But there was no star over the manger in Bethlehem. Ever. There was no star. So I want to show you that this morning. So let's take a little look here about the myths of Christmas. Now here's something interesting. There are 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But only 2 of those Gospels say anything about the birth of Jesus Christ. Matthew and Luke. And in Matthew it says, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. And then the next verse, the first verse of chapter 2 says, and wise men came from the east to visit Jesus. But what the Bible, what's not clear to you until you research it, is that there's a 2-year break between the last verse of chapter 1 and the first verse of chapter 2. And then you get into Luke, and in Luke, Jesus is born, and then he goes for circumcision after 8 days, and then 30 days goes to the temple to be dedicated. And then they head straight back to Nazareth. And then between that verse and the very next verse, verse 22, I believe I'll look at it here in just a second, there is a 12-year break. But right in the middle of a chapter, between 2 verses, there's a 12-year break. Because the next one verse has got him going home as a baby to Nazareth, and the very next verse, he's 12 years old in the temple, teaching the rabbis in the temple. So when you there's a difference between Bible reading and Bible study. And when you study the Bible in detail, you begin to understand what these breaks are all about and why they're there. So anyway, only those 2 books record the birth of Jesus. Matthew is written, the Christmas birth story in Matthew is written from Joseph's perspective. The angel comes to Joseph in Matthew and tells him, don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife. You know, she's a child of the Holy Spirit. And so Matthew is written from Joseph's perspective. You don't hear anything about Mary in this process until later in Matthew. Luke is written from Mary's perspective. In Luke, the angel comes to Mary. And Luke covers the trip Mary has made to visit Elizabeth, her cousin, and then Jesus it will be the cousin of John the Baptist when Jesus is born. So those two books are written from those two different perspectives. We take a look at, in Matthew, there's no mention of an inn in Matthew. There is no mention of a Roman census. There's no mention of a stable or a manger or shepherds or angels singing or sheep in the field at night. None of that is in the Matthew Jesus birth story. In Luke, there's no mention of wise men or gifts. There's no star in Luke. There's no killing of babies. You know, Herod sent the army to kill babies in Bethlehem 2 years old and younger. There's no killing of babies, and there's no fleeing into Egypt in Luke. Why the difference? Why do you think there could be such a difference in these Jesus birth stories in these two famous gospel accounts? Any ideas?
Different perspective of different people.
Richard Green gets the star and the smiley face. Different perspectives. For instance, if you're driving down the road and you see an auto accident, and it's a terrible accident, and cars are all banged up, you know, and an ambulance is there, and then you get home and you tell your spouse, there was a terrible accident and there were 2 cars involved, and so on and so forth. Somebody else who got there earlier saw a 3rd car that had already been towed away when you got there. So your perspective would say 2 cars crashed on the highway, somebody was hurt, the ambulance was there. They went home and told their spouse there was a 3-car pileup on the car. And let's suppose you wrote those 2 stories and put them in the newspaper. And people would say, well, which one's an idiot here? Was it 2 cars or was it 3 cars? The answer is yes, it was. That is the perspective. Scholars have wondered whether or not, following Jesus' death on the cross, whether or not the disciples might have interviewed Mary to talk about what happened when Jesus was born. And then other disciples along the way, as they went along the way and met Jesus, and they might have interviewed her earlier or interviewed even, and we don't know when Joseph died, but might have even met Joseph and interviewed him. And, you know, well, tell us what happened. And he would tell what happened, and the angel came to him. And the angel came to both of them. It's just that whoever interviewed them got the story from that different perspective, as Richard said. So we find these 2 books seem to be different, but they include different information. Where was Jesus born? Well, the scripture said he was born in Bethlehem. Bethlehem was a town of about 300. Bethlehem was famous for being of the lineage of David. Why? Because King David was born in Bethlehem. And when King David, as a little kid, brought the cheese and bread to his brothers fighting in the army and ended up fighting against Goliath, I was over in Israel earlier this year, and I went to that valley where David fought Goliath, and I picked up some stones from that creek and brought them home. And I've got them as souvenirs. But the guy pointed and he said, Bethlehem is 11 miles right over there. So David walked 11 miles from Bethlehem. So Bethlehem was very famous for David being born there, King David, a man after God's own heart, the scripture says. And so Bethlehem was, at that Jesus time, it was about 300. What most people don't know is Bethlehem started out as a military outpost. It was an army base when it first started out. Why? Because Bethlehem is located on top of the best aquifer water source in the area. And at that time, Jerusalem was getting its water from Bethlehem. So they put an army garrison there to guard the area so enemies wouldn't come and confiscate the water or divert the water away from them. So Bethlehem started as an army post and then grew into a village, and eventually David was born there, and so on. So Bethlehem was a small town. There's no record of a Motel 6 anywhere in Bethlehem. Motels during that period of history were very few, first of all, had to pay for a place to stay. But they were along the major highways. The Romans had them built along major highways, mainly for Roman use, but anybody else could stay if there was room and pay for that. So, why in Bethlehem? Well, it was the city of David, as I said, and it was famous for David being born there. So, the prominent family in Bethlehem was probably who? David's down the road relatives. So they were the well-known family. They were esteemed as relatives of David, and that is the family to which Mary and Joseph are coming to from Nazareth as they travel to Nazareth. They're going to that house. They're going to visit that family because all the family had to get together to be counted in the census. When was Jesus born? Well, pretty much Christian and non-Christian historians all agree that he was born approximately between 7 and 4 BC. The reason that he wasn't born 0 is that the calendar wasn't constructed until centuries later, when the calendar was finally decided upon. And then as they backtracked from that calendar, they discovered about when the time Herod died somewhere between 4 and 1 BC. And we know Herod was alive when Jesus was born. So Jesus was born approximately somewhere between 7 and 4 BC. On what day was Jesus born? Well, there are 3 hints. If you do Bible study, do historical research in commentaries and so on, there are 3 hints that you have to try to determine on what day Jesus was born. You have the shepherds, the census, and Zacharias. So look at the shepherds. The shepherds did not tend sheep outside at night in the wintertime. Along about the beginning of November 1st, second week of November or so, it was too cold. And so the shepherds would bring the sheep back into the house. Pretty much every house had a stable. The bottom floor of the house was the stable. The second floor of the house was the living quarters where they slept and ate and so on. If they were a well-to-do house, they either had a third floor, which was the guest room, or that guest room was built on the side of the stable. It was a separate room for storage and for people to stay in when they came to visit. Poorer families, or common families, would have a ladder up to the ceiling with a hole in the ceiling, and up on the roof they would put hay up on the roof as a sleeping thing. Sometimes they would put poles up with a canvas on top to ward off the rain or whatever, and that was their guest room on top of the house. So we know he wasn't born in the wintertime because the shepherds were out in the fields, and they didn't do that about November through February. What about the census? There's no record of a Roman census in the winter. They wanted good weather so people would respond. They would put out the word for a census and require people to come and be counted, but it wasn't the same for the whole entire country, the whole entire area. They would have officials who would come to make sure the count was correct, and they couldn't be everywhere at once. So if they said the Roman census is going to be the Roman census, it would be different in Bethlehem, which is about 5.5 miles from Jerusalem, than it would from Nazareth. Nazareth is about 70 miles north. So it would be different times for those places because they didn't have thousands of officials to go make sure the census was counted properly. So there's no record of a census in the wintertime because the Romans wanted people to be able to actually go and get counted so they could get more tax money. It's all about money, right? So, Zacharias in Luke 1:5, the Jewish records says that he served around the last week of June. So if you read the account over here in Luke about Zacharias, and I read it many, many times in my life, I read this account. It said it in, let's see here. There was Luke 1, starting in verse 5, it says, there was in the days of Herod, king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias of the division of Abijah. You know, I read this Christmas story my whole life, and I never stopped on that word, Abijah. But when I started researching this, I stopped and looked and I said, now why would they tell us in what sequence he was serving? Because you read about other priests in the Bible, and I never found a place where it tells the sequence in which they served as priests, because they rotated as priests. So then I asked myself, well, why would they tell us here? He was of the division of Abijah. So I looked it up, and the Jews kept very, very, very good, close records of which priests served when. And they had like 26 divisions, then they would serve twice a year. And 26 divisions of the terms of service. And then when they repeated those, a different priest would do different ones. And as it turns out, when Zacharias was serving in the division of Abijah, that division was, the scholars are not sure exactly what day it was, but it was somewhere around the last week of June, first week of July. Well, one of the things that Zacharias had prayed about is that he and his wife didn't have any kids. And here they were in their 80s, 90s, and no kids. And so they had pretty much given up. Well, while he was serving as a priest, God came to him and revealed to him that they were going to have a son. And the son would turn out to be John the Baptist. And so immediately when he got home, Elizabeth got pregnant. 9 months later, John the Baptist was born. So looking at the end of June, early July, John the Baptist would have been born somewhere around March, early April, in that time frame. Well, in the Bible, we know that Jesus was born 6 months after John the Baptist. As a matter of fact, when Mary, who was pregnant, came to see Elizabeth, John the Baptist was in the womb of Elizabeth and jumped for joy in the womb at the presence of Jesus, who Mary was pregnant at the time. So looking at those things, you discover that it was virtually impossible for Jesus to be born December 25th. So Jesus was born somewhere around end of September, early October. That's the best guess. His birth has been celebrated at so many different times throughout history. In the early centuries, 4th, 5th, and so on centuries, it was celebrated the 1st of April was one. The 31st of, somewhere around the last part of March, it was also celebrated at one time. There were some groups that celebrated in June, Jesus' birthday. So nobody knew for sure the day was born, and we still don't know for sure the day Jesus was born. So 9 months John the Baptist was born in March, plus 6 months Jesus was born somewhere around September, October. The place of Jesus' birth. There's an N listed in Luke 2:7. So if I look at Luke chapter 2, let's just start with first. And it came to pass in those days that Caesar Augustus, that the world decreed that the world should be registered, and the census took place when Quirinius was governor of Syria. So all went to be registered, everyone to their own city. Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth, which is about 70 miles down, to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because there was no house, because that was the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed wife, who was with child. So it was that while they were there in Bethlehem, while they were there, the days were accomplished for her to be delivered. And she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. And so I looked up that word, the Greek word for inn. And the word is kataluma. Kataluma is the word that they use there for inn. So, right there, kataluma. That word translates guest room, not motel. It translates guest room. So if you fast forward down to Luke 10:34, we have the story of the Good Samaritan. And the Samaritans were despised by the Jews. The Samaritan is going down the road, and there's this guy in the ditch who got beat up by thieves and robbed. He's all bloody and everything, and he's really hurting. And you got the religious people. The story goes, the religious people come up and see him, and they walk around on the other side because they don't want to mess with this guy. And finally, the guy that is least expected to help, the Samaritan guy, comes by, gets the guy, patches him up, and takes him to an inn and pays for him to stay at the inn while he's gone. And he said, when I come back, I'll pay you if I owe more. So in that particular case, the word inn is translated pandokion. Pandokion means a guest room for hire that you pay for. Two different guest rooms. One you pay for, and the kataluma, which is a guest room in a house. So Jesus was born in a house. He was born in the house of the lineage of David, that family, which would have had a large house. They would have had a guest room, as pretty much every house had some sort of guest room accommodations. And those guest room accommodations were called kataluma, guest room. Now, you also fast forward to the story of Jesus on the last week of his life. He's getting ready for the Passover, and he tells his disciples, go into the city. We need a place for the Passover, so go into the city. You're going to see a guy with a water pot on his shoulders. Follow him to the house. Tell the owner of the house we have need of his kataluma. We have need of his guest room. Then he will show you a large upper room that is furnished. The word is identical. Kataluma means guest room. The story of Jesus showing up at Motel 6 and being turned away and going out to find some cave or some stable somewhere out in the middle of the field, that's the thought process, is not true. He went home. He went to and Luke says Jesus wasn't born the day they got there. Luke says the days were, while they were there, the days were accomplished that she gave birth. So there were a number of days, perhaps a week or more, that they were in Bethlehem before Jesus was born. Why wasn't there room in the guest room? Mary and Joseph had to come the most distant from Nazareth, about 70 miles, which would have taken maybe 10 days. You know, she was pregnant, riding on the donkey's on. So it would have taken a while. They were probably the last ones there, and the guest room was already full of people. The second thing is, when women gave birth in those days, it was a village process. All the women came to help with the birth, to be midwives and to heat water and all kinds of stuff. And there would not have been room in the guest room with all those people for all those women to gather around Mary to help her. So the most available place was the stable downstairs. And in that stable, and I saw some of those houses, one in Nazareth actually where Jesus grew up. And it was exactly the same as they did in those days. And there was a stable in the bottom floor, and along one wall was a stone, carved out of the wall, stone wall, manger. The manger's a feed trough. That's what it is. And so the manger would have been along one wall, so all the animals could eat at the same time. And that little carved out manger along that wall is where they laid Jesus. And put perhaps some hay in there. And then the cloths that they used, the swaddling clothes, were cloths that they used to wipe the animals down with, clean up in the stable. And that's what he was wrapped in when he was born. So this is a standard, typical guest room of many of the upper income family homes of that day. And they used it for storage when guests weren't there. And when family came for whatever event, if there was a big event in Jerusalem, family from out of town would come and stay here because it's only 5.5 miles to Jerusalem from here. And they could easily go to the celebration in Jerusalem. So that is a kataluma. The place of Jesus' birth, if you look at it, in Matthew 2:11, it says, by the way, let me back up to chapter 1 so you see that transition I talked about. Verse 24, and Joseph, being aroused from sleep, did as the angel of the Lord commanded him, and took his wife Mary, and he did not know her until she brought forth her firstborn son and called his name Jesus. Then the next verse, in verse 1 of chapter 2, Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, and saying, Where is he who was born King of the Jews? We have seen his star in the east, and have come to worship him. And doing Bible study, I had to stop in that verse. It said, we have seen his star in the east. Well, we know they came from across the Euphrates River, not too far from Baghdad, probably up in the mountains, mostly across that Euphrates River, which is about 170 miles from Bethlehem. And they came from over there. So I looked at that verse and I said, now wait a minute. If there had been a star over Bethlehem, that would have been in the west, not the east. Because they were in the east, and Bethlehem is west. And if there had been a star hanging in the sky over that city, it would have been in the west. But these guys said, we have seen his star in the east. So doing Bible study, I had to stop and say, wait a minute. How could they see it in the east if it was in the west? So I did research on the star. Well, the wise men came, and they came 2 years later, because it says here in chapter 2, they were talking to Herod the king, and so, let's see, verse 9, and when they heard the king said, I don't know where he is. They said, where is the King of the Jews? He said, I don't know where he is. Go find him, and when you find him, come and tell me so I can worship him too. Well, he wanted to kill him. He didn't want to worship him. But he said, so verse 9 it says, when they heard the king, they departed, and behold, listen to this now, the star which they had seen in the east went before them. So there's a star moving before them. Isn't that interesting? And it says, and the star, when they saw the star, let's see, and the star went before them until it came and stood over where the young child was. And when they saw that star over him, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. And when they had come into the house, not the stable, not a manger, not a cave, when they came into the house, it says, and they saw the young child with Mary, his mother, they fell down and worshipped him, and then they opened their treasures and presented to him gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Well, wise men in those days traveled in groups of about 10 to 12. They had an entourage of 150 to 200. They had slaves. They had hired military guards. They hired a military unit to go with them to protect them. They had servants. They had engineers to help them wherever they went and analyze what they were either building or what they were researching. And so there had been a huge group traveling with these wise men. Going from Baghdad, going from Iraq area all the way to Bethlehem, there would have been perhaps as many as 50 small kingdoms. Small areas that you might have been a governor or a king of a certain area, and people, the way you got money is if people wanted to travel through your area, you charge them. They had to pay you to travel through your particular area. And they would have stopped at your palace or whatever, and they would have done what they normally did. They give honors. They would have a meal. They would stay for maybe a week. They would present gifts to you, probably some gold, frankincense, and myrrh also. But they would have many other gifts. We three kings of Orient are, why? Well, because 3 gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But there were a lot more than 3 kings, 3 wise men. And so they visited Jesus, not in a manger, they visited Jesus in a house. And this is a depiction of what that house would have looked like. It would have been a manger on the bottom. It would have been a, where's my little thing? There we go. It would have been a second floor with beds and eating area and a stable down here. And then on top of the house would have been a guest room, covered guest room, or if they were a well-to-do family off to the side of perhaps the stable, would have been a separate room, a guest room for people to stay in. So that is a depiction, and we saw houses just like this in Israel while we were there. And in Nazareth, we saw houses built just like that up there. And they had a ladder. We'd go up to the top, to the roof, and we even saw houses with ladders up to the roof as well. And they would have, they would have been in the stable where Mary would have given birth to Jesus. The Church of the Nativity, there are various tourist areas in Bethlehem. As the years and centuries went by, there were many places who claimed to be the birthplace of Jesus. Why? Because people want to make money. Because the fame of Jesus was spreading, the gospel of Jesus was spreading as the disciples preached everywhere. And people were getting saved, they were accepting Christ as Savior, and they wanted to go see where Jesus was born. I mean, that was the famous place to them. And so they would go to Bethlehem looking for it, and people would make money by saying, well, he was born right here. Here's the stable and the manger. Here, give me 50 cents and you can go see. And so there are a lot of places like that, and so nobody knew exactly which one was true. Here's something really interesting that I discovered. The Emperor Hadrian, which is if you've ever been to England, Hadrian's Wall is in the north part of England. Hadrian had that wall built about the year 100 or so. In the early 100s, Hadrian captured that cave. He either bought it or captured that cave where the Church of the Nativity is built today. And he made it the worship center for Adonis. Right there. Adonis, the goddess of beauty and desire. And for over 100 years, it was the worship center for that goddess. They built Asherah groves. They planted Asherah groves all around that cave. Now it's just a city and you can't see any dirt anywhere there. But they planted Asherah. And what are Asherah trees for? Well, if you read the Bible about the high places of worship where they had prostitutes and they had idol worship and so on the high places all over that part of the world, all of the poles that were at the center of worship were Asherah trees. And those poles came from this cave area where Hadrian planted the Asherah groves of trees. So anyway, the poles were, you've seen people dancing around with the streamers down from the pole, and they dance around and it goes around the pole. That's where that tradition came from, except that it was a prostitute worship process for them to do that on these Asherah poles. And so that cave, where that church is today, that cave was a worship center for Adonis. The Church of the Nativity, in AD 327, the Emperor Constantine captured the cave. He cut down all the Asherah trees, cleaned out all the worship stuff, and his mother, Helena, decided that that was the birthplace of Jesus. And that's where the Church of the Nativity is built today, is over that site. And the church is still there. I've been to that church recently, and it covers almost an entire city block. It's absolutely huge. And why are Matthew and Luke different? Together they show the timeline of Jesus' early life. And this timeline is here. He was born in Bethlehem. He was circumcised in Jerusalem on the 8th day. He was presented at the temple on the 30th day. Then returned home north 70 miles to Nazareth. Then, sometime in the first 2 years, the scholars cannot figure out exactly when during those 2 years, Joseph and Mary either moved to Bethlehem to be with family, moved his business to Bethlehem. They either moved to Bethlehem or they traveled to Bethlehem and stayed with their family for some big celebration in Jerusalem. Scholars are not sure why they went back to Jerusalem sometime during those 2 years. Most of them actually believe they moved the business because of a scripture verse a little bit later, and I'll share with you in a minute. So while they were there during that 2 years, they went back to Jerusalem, to Bethlehem, where he was born, for some reason. And that was where they were when the wise men came 2 years after Jesus was born. How do we know 2 years? Because they told Herod that they saw the star 2 years earlier before they got there. The star appeared to them when Jesus was born. It appeared to them over in the east. So, they flee to Egypt and they're there for 1 to 2 years. Then they return to Nazareth after Herod's death. And the scripture says that when they returned to Egypt, they heard Herod died. When they returned to Egypt, they were afraid of Herod's son. So it says that they decided to move to Nazareth. That's why scholars believe they actually moved to Bethlehem during that first 2 years. it says they were afraid to go home because of Herod's son, so they decided to move to Nazareth. So, Matthew 2, 1 through 3 talks about a star. Well, what star was it? Scholars believe that nobody but the wise men saw that star, ever. There's no record of it over Bethlehem in the book of Luke. There's no record of a star. When the shepherds came to see Jesus and the angels were singing at his birth, there was no record of a star. And we see this big star, this big light coming down and all that stuff. Didn't happen. The scholars believe that the star was some sort of a light that God put out before that group of wise men to guide them all the way from wherever they were in Iraq, all the way to Bethlehem. And that same star or light that God revealed to them, whether it was a physical light or just in their mind that God put in their mind to guide them, that star is what they followed. I mean, now it's only 5.5 miles from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. And they are following a star. I mean, if it was a star hanging up in the sky, I mean, it would look the same to everybody. And why didn't Herod see the star? If it was hanging over Bethlehem, why didn't Herod see the star and know where Jesus was? Why didn't the newspaper see it? Write about the star. Because nobody else saw that star but the wise men. Have I destroyed your Christmas yet? In Matthew 2, 3, 1, what star? How did the wise men know that what that star meant when they saw it over in the east? They had never been they weren't Jews. They didn't know about prophecy or stuff like that. How could they have known about what that star meant? Well, some scholars believe, and I'm certainly not a scholar, what happened about 400, 450 years earlier? What happened in the Baghdad, Iraq area? Well, the Jews were taken into captivity. Who was the main guy taken into captivity in that area? He was in the lion's den. His name was Daniel. Daniel was taken captive, and the king was so impressed that he made him second in command. Daniel was a godly man who taught everybody and told everybody he knew who God was and why he believed what he believed. He wouldn't eat the king's food. They were almost ready to kill him because he wouldn't eat the king's food. And he said, we're going to be vegetarians, and they turned out to be more handsome and more healthy than anybody else. And so they made him second in command. And so Daniel taught everyone what he believed spiritually. And Daniel knew the prophecy. And the prophecy was that the Messiah would come. And that there would be a sign. God would give a sign that the Messiah had come. And I agree with some of those guys who believe that when God revealed that star to them, it reminded them of what Daniel said about the prophecy. That's how they knew who Jesus was, what his name was, and that he was supposed to be king of the Jews. In Daniel was 1620 to 538 BC. So it's actually he was about 530 years earlier. Was it a physical star? Well, we don't know for sure. If it was a physical star, why didn't Herod see it? Why didn't the others see it? Or was it a spiritual star? We just don't know. But whatever God gave guided them. In Matthew 2, 16 is the record of Herod after the wise men leave. Herod, and they didn't come back to tell him. And so Herod felt threatened. His kingdom felt threatened because whoever that kid was born in Bethlehem was destined to be king, which Herod meant he was going to lose his throne. And so to defend his throne, he sent his soldiers to kill every child, every boy, 2 years old and younger in Bethlehem. Why didn't Herod go himself? Normally, kings led the fight to defend their throne. Kings led in battle. Why didn't Herod go? Well, the scripture has no clue why Herod didn't go. But Bill O'Reilly did. And Bill O'Reilly did the actual non-spiritual research. He did the historical research of people during that day. And he wrote Killing Jesus. Who has read Killing Jesus? You guys need to read Killing Jesus. In the book, he does the research on Herod the daily schedule of Herod. As it turns out, Herod didn't go that day because he had gout in his left big toe and he couldn't get his boots on. That's why Herod didn't go himself. And he sent his soldiers, the centurion, to kill those babies. Why December 25th? Well, the first 3 centuries, there was no celebration at all of Jesus' birth. And some groups today believe any celebration of a deity's birth, because deities don't have births, a birthday. So Constantine started the first official celebration of Christmas in 336. He set it to coincide with Yule, which was the pagan celebration, because he wanted the pagans to come into Christianity. He wanted them all to embrace in one fatal swoop. They want to embrace Christianity, so they negotiated, and they said, okay, we can worship your God, and so on. However, we got to keep our celebrations, and so they kept the Yule celebration, and the Yule celebration was in the winter solstice, which was December 24th, 25th, depending on how you read the calendar. And the Yule, and I don't recommend this to everybody, but I went to the current pagan website to see if that celebration is still on, and it is. They still celebrate the Yule. And the Yule is, let's see if I've got the pagan midwinter solstice celebration of the sun god. It is the burning of a Yule log to celebrate the sun god. It is the decorating with evergreen. The kids would take baskets of evergreen covered with gifts. They would go house to house giving gifts. That was all part of Yule. And so because of that, those pagan celebrations became part of Christmas. I went to the Celtic Connection. It's where I found the current celebrations. And have you ever heard the song, "Here we go a-wassailing among the fields so green"? Well, I looked up on this website what wassailing is. Wassailing was part of the pagan celebration. And wassailing, the instructions are to gather together in groups, to get drunk, to go from house to house singing as loud as you can, and to go out into the fields and put a pagan blessing on the fields so that in the spring they would produce good crops. And so that's what wassailing was. Now, some of you might like the getting drunk part. I'm not sure. But it's drink a lot of alcohol, get together and in revelry, and yell and scream and sing, and go out in the fields and put a pagan blessing on the fields. So that's what the Yule, the celebration of the sun god, was all about. Christmas was outlawed. Early Christmas groups felt that it was blasphemy, and some felt that it was just a Catholic celebration, so they didn't have to worry about it. The Catholics had embraced Christmas in the 326 when Constantine made it a real celebration. That's when the Catholic Church embraced the celebration of Christmas in the winter time. So some groups felt that it wasn't anything except a Catholic celebration, so they didn't celebrate Christmas at all, the birth of Jesus. The Pilgrims came over in 1620. The Puritans came in 1630. And when the Puritans came for religious freedom, they outlawed the celebration of Christmas. They felt that it was blasphemy to attach an earthly celebration of drinking and cake and whatever else you want to do to God himself, because Jesus was God. He is God. And they felt that it was blasphemy to say that he had an earth, although he was physically born of Mary, that spiritually, that he had an earthly birth spiritually, because he always was God. And so they actually outlawed the celebration of Christmas, and you could be arrested for celebrating Christmas starting in 1630. The law was revoked in the late 1600s, but Christmas celebrations were still shunned until it became commercialized in the 1700s. Once they started Christmas shops, once they started selling Christmas stuff, the church slacked off on their resistance of Christmas. And the church has been slacking off ever since. And it is now the biggest commercialized celebration in the world. And somewhere, by the way, last December when I was doing this, in the news last December, China officially outlawed the celebration of Christmas. And this was I did this for my Sunday school class about 2 weeks before Christmas. And that week, China had officially outlawed Christmas in their country. You got St. Nicholas, you got St. Nick, you got Kris Kringle, you got Pez Nickel. In the States, in the Northeast, you Northeasterners are weird anyway, but in the Northeast, they had a Christmas person named Pez Nickel. And Pez Nickel, all the children feared him because he brought bad gifts. If you've been bad in the year, Pez Nickel came to punish kids for being bad. But he brought gifts, to the good kids. And then finally evolved into Santa Claus, and he's fat and jolly and brings gifts, and I'm glad he does. Several years ago, Sandy gave me a Christmas gift, and I opened it, and I thought, this is the most thoughtful gift ever. And it was a box full of little things that you get at Lowe's. You go to Lowe's and they got the sale table there, and it's got little flashlights and little screwdrivers, and it's got little tape measures and all kinds of stuff. It was full of those, like 10 or 15 of those little things like that. And I thought, how thoughtful to give a guy who's a carpenter, and so all these little things. And I said, oh, honey, thank you very much. And she had this cheeky grin, from ear to ear. And she's staring at me with this grin on her face. And I'm looking at all these gifts. And I said, where did you buy these? She said, I didn't. I got them out of your shop. Do I hear an amen? Some of you wives know what we're talking about. I had no idea those things were in my shop. So Christmas gifts are okay, It's the costliest holiday. Americans spend about $465 billion on Christmas, which has nothing to do with spiritual things, which is an average of $700 to $1,000 per family. Very little money for any true Christmas celebration at all. At all. So, now what? Traditions. You got a Christmas tree. Most people have a Christmas tree, and that is tradition. I had a Christmas tree last year. Sandy passed away, that year, and it was a struggle. First of all, to find the Christmas decorations, to put up Christmas decorations. It was one of the toughest things I've ever done. But I did, for the grandkids. The grandkids were coming over, and Sandy was on the tree. And she was indeed an angel, as some of you who knew her well know very well. The tradition is to have a nativity. And I had a nativity with my gifts under a nativity. And the typical nativity is Mary and Joseph in the manger and baby Jesus in a little, not in a real manger, but in a wooden, they never had wooden mangers, but he's in there, right in front of Mary and Joseph. And then you got the shepherds standing around, and you got the animals inside the stable, which there would have been animals in there. And then you got the wise men with their camels outside, and the wise men are in there kneeling and giving gifts, which is totally unrealistic. And I understand why people do that, because they didn't get there for 2 years, and so they don't want to wait 2 years to put the wise men in there. And I can understand that. So, I'm not going to be too upset with wise men in your nativity. But this was the nativity, and I built this for my class, and then I had it in my house. Traditions. Well, when were the traditions started for your family, and where are the traditions carried out? Are they carried out, in somebody's grandma's house? Everybody shows up. We used to show up at Mom and Dad's house. 10 kids showing up at Mom and Dad's house for Christmas, every Christmas, bringing gifts. And the gifts would be so piled up high you couldn't see the Christmas tree, all the way to the ceiling, because 10 kids and then about 25 grandkids would show up, and Mom and Dad right in the middle of all that. I remember my dad used to make coffee. We'd stay with him when we came home for this, and he'd put a stew cup, a pot on the stove full of water. He'd boil the water, and he'd put a handful of coffee grounds in the boiling water, let it boil for a little bit. He'd take it off the fire, set it over. He'd reach over under the faucet, get a handful of cold water, and throw it on top of the pot, and the coffee grounds would settle with that cold water. They would settle at the bottom, and he'd pour him a cup of coffee. And we thought, Dad has to do that every year. We're going to get him a coffee pot. So we bought him a Mr. Coffee, and he didn't use it. And then the next year, they bought him another Mr. Coffee. One year, I went home, and I'm looking for a cup to get me some coffee out of his 2-cup. I opened the pantry, and there were 6 coffee pots. Brand new ones. He has 2-cup on the stove. So Dad didn't necessarily need gifts. Why do we do this? Why do we celebrate Christmas? Why do we celebrate the birth of Jesus? It's something incredible. Something is different about Jesus. I don't know what your religious preferences are, and I don't know what your celebrations are, and I don't know how you worship or when you worship. Some people worship on other days other than Sunday, and that's okay. And I don't know what your traditions are, but have you ever asked yourself the question, why do we do what we do? Why do we talk about the baby Jesus in the manger, and why do we give gifts, and why do we do those things? And normally we don't ask ourselves that question. We just keep doing it because Mom and Dad did, or because Grandma and Grandpa did. And what happens to us is we get caught up in the process. We get caught up in the mechanics of making Christmas happen. Now, let me give you a sad truth. The highest suicide rate in America happens between Thanksgiving and New Year's. There are people who can't see any way to be thankful in November when Thanksgiving comes around. They don't have, in their mind, they have nothing to be thankful for. And they dread the coming of Christmas because in their minds, all of you people are going to be happy, and you're walking around in the snow, and you're going to be jingle bells, you know, the horse is going to go by with the sleigh, you know, and in their mind, this Christmas thing is unfolding, and they don't have it. They don't get it. They're not happy. They're not satisfied. And Christmas and Thanksgiving reminds them of their situation. And the highest suicide rate is during those holidays. Isn't that sad? It's really sad. Ask yourself, why do you do what you do? Do you really celebrate Christ at Christmas, or do you celebrate Santa Claus? You celebrate the tree and the gifts and the wrapping and all that stuff you're going to throw away the next day, and the trash man hates to come to your house after Christmas. He hates to come to anybody's house after Christmas. Why do you do what you do? Ask yourself that question. Is Christ, for Christmas anyway, is Christ the center of your celebration? If you celebrate Hanukkah, I mean, is it a process? Is it just a process? Or are you really celebrating God? You know? What do you celebrate? Why do you celebrate? Why do you spend all that money to buy toys that are going to be played with for a week and throw away? Why do you do that? Like my grandkids, the best gift they ever got was the old refrigerator carton that I cut a door out of. And they played in that thing for months until it just fell apart. You know? Why do you do what you do? Why do you spend what you spend for Christmas? Why do you do that? Whatever your celebration is, I want to say to you, even in this month of October, I want to say Merry Christmas. Remember, the big part of that word Christmas is Christ. And if you have no recognition of Him, if you have no real celebration of Him, if you have no acknowledgement of Him, you're not doing Christmas. You're doing celebration of some kind. You're doing gift giving of some kind. There's nothing wrong with giving gifts. But if it's going to be a real Christmas, Christ's got to be in there. We do a birthday celebration for Jesus. And don't tell the Puritans, okay? It's against the law, you know? But at my house, we do a birthday celebration for Jesus. And the grandkids make birthday cards. Happy birthday cards for Jesus. Because I want them to understand that it's not just Santa Claus, and it's not just gifts, and it's not just paper and ribbon and jingle bells. It is Christmas. That's what it is. So, does all that make sense? All right. Pat, do you have a closing song for us?
Not after this. Now you know what's going to happen when we start getting ready for Christmas, right? We're going to start thinking about this and feeling really guilty.
So for Christmas, instead of bearing gifts, I'm bearing guilt.
Amen. We believe that. All right. I'll tell you what, let's do this. Would you join me in saying the Lord's Prayer? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. Let me ask you a question. Have we worshipped here today? Yes. Are you sure?
Yes.
Why? Because we heard the word. We heard the word. Number one. Number two, what does the Bible say? Where two or more are gathered, where? In his name. There's no paraphernalia, no altar, no choir, no organ, no piano. But did we worship?
No collection plate.
No.
Yeah. Actually standing at the door with his hand up. See, now you can tell the difference between the Baptist preacher and the Methodist preacher. He's preached for an hour. If I'd have done that, there'd have been a council meeting after church and asking me that I need a new watch. Can you stand one more song? All right.
If you sing it, not laugh.
All right. There's a picture on the wall that brings me comfort. Weary eyes rest on it from time to time. It's a sweet, unique depiction of my Savior, the only one I know quite of its kind. I see him laughing, my Lord is laughing, his head thrown back with joy among his loving face, and in that moment there's something happens. I feel at peace just seeing Jesus laughing. To the left, just above the picture, there sits a wooden cross upon the shelf. Sometimes it seems just like the Lord gazing at the swallow, straight into the face of death itself. I see him laughing, ha ha ha. Can you imagine that? His head thrown back with joy upon his loving face, and in that moment there's something happens. I feel at peace just seeing Jesus laughing. In my heart I hold a gentle vision other side. He'll hold me in his arms and whisper, welcome. As I look into his smiling eyes, and I'll see him laughing. I know he's laughing. His head thrown back with joy upon his loving face. And in that moment, lay down my burdens, and everlasting peace with Jesus laughing. I'll join the angels, singing and clapping. The victory won and me and Jesus laughing. And let all God's people say amen.